My name is Lisa Farley. I am the Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Education, and I am thrilled to be here with you this evening to moderate the event. In a few moments, Dean Savage will say a few words about the lecture series itself in the opening remarks of his talk. But I'd like to begin tonight with York University's land acknowledgement. As we are not all gathered on the same space, this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory you are currently on. If this is the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And now it is with great pleasure and honor that I introduce our speaker. Dr. Robert Savage is currently the Dean of the Faculty of Education at York University. Rob joined York in July of 2021. Before that, he was head of department at that's a good slip. He was head of department at University College London, Institute of Education. He was a William Dawson Scholar at McGill University in Montreal before that. He has published over 120 book chapters, reviews, and research articles, most often in leading international journals. Dean Savage is a school-based psychologist and classroom teacher by training, and from these applied experiences, maintains an interest in making schools effective learning places for all children. He is interested in policy questions, such as how we can make schools more inclusive and classroom teaching and parenting maximally effective for children, and in the design of good evidence-based programs in achieving this aim. He is particularly interested in addressing early reading and spelling challenges, often using technology. He has published over 25 reading intervention studies on 4 continents. These sorts of studies are hard to do well, but are crucial and thus take up most of his professional research time these days. This work involves helping teachers understand and use phonics and other systems and strategies to read, and how to use such approaches to support all children. His work also involves thinking about the complex spelling system of English and the capacities needed to master it, the role of books and other resources, and effective professional development. It's an honor to welcome Dean Savage, and I think I speak for the room in saying that we are all looking forward to your talk entitled Making Sense of the Great Reading Debate, a Guide to the Science and Practice of Helping All Children Read. Over to you, Dean Savage.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And a very warm welcome to everybody. Annie, bonjour, and bienvenue tout le monde to this. Thank you very much for your interest in my talk, but in the public lecture series more generally. So I'm just going to say a few words by way of welcome and context before I get started on the public lecture series of my talk. I just wanted to say we've got a whole range of folk here this evening, and I really appreciate your time and interest again. We have teachers and parents, most importantly. We have a number of other representatives, deans of education, faculties are here tonight, I understand, directors of education, representatives from the Ontario College of Teachers, the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Colleges and Universities, York's own Teacher Education Advisory Committee, representatives from the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Council of Ontario Universities. I thank you very much, everybody. I would like to just say you probably saw that the session is being recorded and will be made available after the event. So it'll be just me and the PowerPoint that's being recorded there, nothing else, so that we can widen access. And in terms of access, we were also hoping to start up our live transcript feature for when I'm speaking. I'm not sure if that's running yet. Live transcript is an imperfect tool, as you've probably realized, but that means that there will occasionally be moments where I'm talking about the precision of reading and spelling, and my live transcript doesn't quite represent the same concept. But we thought that accessibility was more important than that consistency there. So we're hoping that will work well for everybody. We would like to encourage you to ask participants to ask questions, place them in the Q&A, and then we're going to curate them because there are a number of people here today. We'll curate them, and then Lisa will be asking me questions at the end of the session. If we cannot get to all of the questions, please feel free to contact us by email at edudean@edu.yorku.ca, and we'll be happy to try and provide answers to you. I'm also finally pleased to say that the talk is being simulcast by VoiceEd Radio, and you can simply go to the link in the chat, voiceed.ca, and access the live button there to access that piece. So without any further ado, what I'll do is I'll ask Kate, who's monitoring my slides this evening, to share screen at this point, so we can introduce I'll start off by introducing the lecture. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so I will ask you the next slide, please. If we can just advance to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So I just wanted to start with a little bit of a notion around why the public lecture series as an idea, because this is the first of a series of planned lectures. And my vision here was really to, as the Dean of the faculty, was to build close collaboration with our communities. And that the public lecture series is an opportunity for us, the university, the Faculty of Education in particular, and our wider community and school partners, parents, and all other interested parties to share some space to discuss important public issues of the day. It's very much my vision that publicly funded universities have a service role to the community, and that we provide certain things of value. We provide a careful scholarship and rigorous research that can speak to questions that the public are interested in, and that the public wants answers to, and that universities should be in that space to help provide informed discussion and guidance where relevant. So we bring those to inform and aid impact. And we're looking, our real raison d'etre is to see positive change and to seek shared ground on key questions to allow that to happen, so that we can build all sorts of problem-solving alliances and supports and enable positive change in society. It's in the nature of the public lecture format that this is a little bit one way in the first instance, but I'm very hopeful that this will seed a two-way learning process where communication between the university, the Faculty of Education and the community is mutually supportive and engaging, and leads us to complex novel answers that we wouldn't otherwise have got to. So we're hoping to organise probably two public lectures a year. And I'm delighted to say that we have not the full programme, because we will organise these over some time, but I'd like to introduce the next two speakers to you, whet your appetite, if you like, for what's to come. So if we can advance to the next slide, please, Kate. So I'm delighted to say that Professor Sue Winton will be speaking probably in the fall around unequal benefits, privatisation and public education in Canada. And that promises to be an extremely engaging and interesting and relevant presentation. I'm delighted that Sue will be speaking. And we also already have lined up, we have Charles Hopkins, who's been working for years in sustainable development, and he will be speaking about educating for tomorrow's unknowns, sustainability front and center, which is clearly an absolutely key area for action, and that he's been involved in for a very, very long time, and lots of interesting things to say there. So these will be our vanguard, and then from there will be a whole series of others that will come in due course. And we're hoping to present the full diversity of the faculty with their eye on being able to speak on questions of general public interest. So that's the public lecture series. I'm delighted now I'll be hosting those to come in due course. I'll turn now to the next slide, and I'd like to get started on the first of these. Is making sense of the great reading debate, a guide to the science and practice of helping all children read. And I have spent many years, I started off life as a teacher and as an educational psychologist, aka a school psychologist in schools, working in often some very challenging contexts, working with children on the verge of exclusion, a whole series of contexts, but also providing supports for school boards and schools in their most effective practices, including around reading and spelling. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of that as we go forward. We can go into the next slide, please, Kate. Thank you. So tonight I'm going to challenge you a little bit. So I'm going to ask you to challenge you to critique all practice, independent of what view of reading you may hold. And I say that because I think we're always learning most when we leave our comfort zones. Any of you out there who are teachers and parents know that that's the case, that's when the learning happens, and that's when change happens. So I'm going to encourage you to think a little bit about that. I'm going to challenge you, but in a good way, with the strongest evidence and with some contemporary theory about reading. And I'm very keen that the whole domain of reading moves away from a kind of clanism and tribalism, which I've sometimes experienced. There's a kind of groups that are mutually supportive and who don't speak to each other, and it can be somewhat rivalrous. And I think that's part of the difficulty. I'm going to encourage you to break some of that down and to really think about what's happening in terms of reading for young people and communities. And so to get there, I think we have to avoid tidy simplifications. Reading is a complex thing. Charles Huey, way back in 1908, described to understand reading would be the very acme of human achievement. More recently, it's been described as rocket science to try and understand the complexities of reading. So we shouldn't be surprised if there aren't tidy simplifications that work here. So I think I'm hoping to aid a suitably complex understanding, but one which will nevertheless allow us to act and allow change to happen. And we do need to make a bigger difference for children, because there still are a significant number of children who struggle with reading. It remains an issue in many countries, not just Canada, but worldwide. And there's certainly the Deloitte report from 2020 estimated that there may be up to 1 million struggling readers in Canada. And we want to support those young people as best as we possibly can, of course. And even outside of the struggling readers, we want to make sure that everybody is a stronger reader, and they have the joy of reading in their lives, no matter who they are. So I think that I've always felt that reading is my way into social change, actually. For me, it's always been a moral and political, economic and social imperative. Literacy is in many ways a gateway. And I think especially now, particularly in the light of the pandemic and the impact that that's had upon a number of children, upon our teachers in training and the whole community. And I think in light of the inequities that have surfaced again during the pandemic and became more and more visible, that this is particularly the case that we need to act now and act well. So if we can go to the next slide, thank you. So we always ask our students to start their essays by thinking about how to define terms. So what is reading and what is literacy? It's a good starting point here. And it's complicated. It actually resists simple definition. At one level, we can think of reading as the use of these abstract shapes that we call letters or other symbols to represent words, a pronunciation and or a meaning, and that we use the products of these letters, this symbol analysis, to represent words. Most of the time, these products are words. Sometimes we can represent syllables, but they're not words on their own. But broadly speaking, they're words. And then, but reading has all sorts of general connotations, doesn't it? We think about reading a room. So reading can be much more than just the letters on the page. And the term literacy is perhaps the broadest one of the term of them all. Back in 2008, the Canadian Council on Learning described literacy as meaning much more than the ability to read and write. To succeed economically and socially, adults need the ability to analyze information, understand abstract ideas, and acquire many other complex life skills. So literacy is a very sophisticated ability to deal with information, to understand and to construct meaning in all aspects of life. Perhaps we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. And there's been a growing sense that there are multiple literacies. Many researchers quite reasonably make the case for some of these. And we could consider, for example, visual spatial literacies, technology literacy, a social emotional literacy, critical literacy. Perhaps you can think of others. I started thinking of media literacy and financial literacy. And all these can be somewhat independent of each other, can't they? They're not necessarily accessing the same thing. And we can continue adding to that list. I came across one just today. I came across the term carbon literacy, which is about the idea that somebody would be a champion, perhaps in an educational institution like a school, a champion of sustainable development with a good understanding of the carbon impact of the activities that are being undertaken. So a carbon literacy, a brand new one to my mind. So we could add to all this. So it's extremely complex to define. But tonight I'm going to focus primarily on what we might consider some of the more basic things. But I'm also going to branch out and link into thinking about the notions around comprehension as well and the construction of meaning. If we can advance to the next slide. Thank you. So the great debate, I use this term quite deliberately because there has been for many years a really significant debate about the nature of reading and therefore about how best to support and teach reading. One view that's been highly influential is the work of Ken Goodman and colleagues, who back in 1967 described reading words as a kind of psycholinguistic guessing game of cues. And what Goodman meant by this is that there's a certain indeterminacy about what's on the page in front of us, and that we have to bring a great deal to the table to understand a piece of text. So in that sense, it's a very complex act of construction where the print on the page is somewhat unreliable in and of itself as a source of information. Later, Smith, in various iterations of his book Understanding Reading, echoed some of these sentiments. And he, for example, described letters on the page acting at best as being sentinels. They're kind of guardians, but they're not very reliable. They're not the way that you use, they're not the process that you use to read words. And this approach has been associated with a model of teaching and understanding reading, which has come to be known as whole language, which places an emphasis on apprenticeship over direct instruction and emphasizes this notion of construction for reading words on the page. So that's one view. An alternative perspective that's sometimes been placed in sharp contrast to this, perhaps associated first with Jean Chal and her work from the 1960s, was the importance of the need for direct instruction in the alphabetic principle and phonics to read. Now, the alphabetic principle is the principle that there are abstract letters that can represent sounds that can in turn represent pronunciations of words and therefore of meanings. And that in alphabetic systems, like English, that one could in principle use phonics to learn to read, and that direct instruction in phonics is necessary for children to succeed. And it's based on the assumption that the information on the printed page is a fairly reliable source of information in the task of reading. So versions of this rather binary contested space have led to significant and sometimes heated debate between practitioners, between policymakers, between academics in universities, and a number of other commentators. And to the point where people have used this term, the reading wars, to describe the interactions between this group. Now, the first thing I'd like to say about this tonight is I'd like this to be the last time I use that phrase, because first of all, I don't think it really helps make sense of what's happening. It rather inflates. More importantly, I think wars are a dreadful thing. We're seeing war and the impacts of real wars, most obviously in Ukraine at the moment, but also around the world, almost it seems without relent. And it just seems to me not appropriate to use that term to describe a debate, however heated, about how children learn to read. So I use the term the Great Debate quite deliberately in my talk, and that's, I think, where I'd like to see it go in the future. Let there be debate. Okay, so coming back to this debate, this has been going on for years. Why might this be? Well, perhaps we can turn to the next slide at this point. Why would this ongoing debate continue? I think there's some things that we can do to situate this. I think we need to ask who benefits from dispute. In a very influential article, Ellen Brantlinger back in 2006 asked that question about special education and inclusive education, another area where there's been quite vociferous disagreement. Who benefits? Who's winning from there being from an ongoing dispute? And that's a good question to ask. And I'm not necessarily saying I have all the answers to that, but I'm pretty sure who doesn't benefit from it. And that would be young children. It would be, I think, very often teachers who are looking for some clarity in making sense, and parents in clarity in making sense of the task of helping supporting young people most effectively. But I'll leave that there for further thought. Other things that I think we can do for making sense of this debate is to make sure we explore the evidence for or against phonics specifically and word reading very carefully. Sure, we also need to make sure that we're thinking about the adequacy of theorizing about the task of learning to read sufficiently. I think it's very important that we explore reading in the round, i.e. not looking just at one part of literacy and reading, but to explore it in the round and critically exploring, for example, comprehension and understanding and meaning making, as well as word reading. I sometimes wonder when I hear some of my colleagues speak that it is a little bit like that situation where blindfolded people are asked to describe an elephant, and those who are near the trunk describe it very differently from those who are near the ears and those who are near the side. We need a full and rounded view on what literacy is if we're going to make impact. I think we need to think about teaching and learning as a very complex art. There's great expertise in teaching, and there's great expertise, just as there's great expertise in parenting. There's an art here It can be informed by, and in some sense shaped by, science, if that science is high quality and reliable. But it's always going to be an art with nuance to it. And I think we have to situate work in important contexts. So there are contexts of different schools and classrooms where the issues can be different, where the nature of the learners can vary significantly. And we have to be, I think, acutely aware of issues around equity and diversity in all that we do. And those contexts really matter in the way that we think about anything that we might construe as being effective. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Thank you, Kate. So having announced this idea that there's been a disagreement, I'm going to suggest some things that could lead us to the end of this disagreement. First of all, I think there needs to be active energy in finding points of agreement and common ground. And I've seen some helpful and hopeful signs of that in the academic community, where I've heard people who are quite critical of certain views of reading looking to find, well, where are the commonalities? What are the things that we could come together over and agree are the core components of any effective literacy? I think we need to note where facts do not fit our theories, and I think that requires us to adjust accordingly. There are relevant facts, they impact upon our theories, and we do need to be aware of those and change the way that we think on the basis of those. That's what scientists do, at least in principle, and I think it's the foundation of I think moving things forward much more purposefully from here. That being said, we need to note that the evidence is sometimes limited, and that there are things that we don't know. So there's also uncertainty, even if we are very focused upon the evidence base. Some things are less secure than other things. Indeed, a wise person once said to beware of certainty, because we rarely get certainty in life. I think we need to be really rigorous and thorough and up to date, but also critical in the work that we're looking at on literacy, as in everything else. I think also we need to disagree well. I think it's a good idea that we see the best in each other and notice that when people do have different views, that they come from places that are well intended, and that those are then the spur for further discussion. So there's a concept that I really like of disagreeing well that I've met in other contexts. I think it really applies to this world in reading. I think we need to place the least powerful people first, and their needs. Children are there, and children who might be at particular risk of struggling with literacy in various ways are high up the list there. But then also so are parents and teachers, and perhaps many others as well. And a final thing that I'd just like to say on this is I think we should accept that some disagreement is healthy. Most areas of human endeavor have disagreements to some degree. So it's not that I think it's realistic that we end all disagreement. Disagreements can be very productive. They can stimulate further thinking and new insights and new ideas. But I think that it needs to be at a level where we can actually do the best for young people. So a few things that I just wanted to share before we move on to the next, the more sort of substantive piece. So in the next slide. So we can go there, please. Thank you, Kate. So there have been a number of arguments that have been placed against the use of phonics. I've chosen a few here. I have heard other ones. But I'll give these as examples of the sorts of things that are sometimes said about what the idea that phonics shouldn't be taught in schools. One claim is that English is too complicated or too non-phonic for phonics to work. And as we'll see later, English is somewhat complicated for sure. Some people will claim that phonics instruction doesn't work. Simple claim based upon saying there isn't evidence that it works. Others might argue, well, phonics takes up time we need for other things, other presumably more important things. I've also heard that phonics is a political problem. It's a problem of a right-wing agenda. It reflects commercial interests. It involves things like expensive basal reader schemes, that it's inherently boring, that it only works for some children, and perhaps the most resigned or comical approach that I've heard is that it reflects fashion, such that whichever theory of reading you hold, you're going to be fashionable twice in your lifetime. We don't know who said that, unfortunately. So there are some arguments that one can hear. I have heard those raised and made by people over the years. So if we can turn to the next slide. Some of those arguments are fairly quickly evaluated, I think. So the idea that it's sort of political or it's a right-wing agenda, well, it can sometimes perhaps be political. I can recall back some 25 years ago, I met an American, a student, when I was doing my PhD, and he asked me what I was doing it on, and I talked about phonics. And he replied, he said, well, I'm a Republican. I'm for phonics. And it was such a bizarre thing to hear that I remember it to this day. Further discussion with him led me to realize that he didn't actually know what phonics was, but he knew he was for it. So that kind of stuff does happen. Things can be politicized. It can be associated with a particular agenda, most definitely. But it's not necessarily the case either. I think it's quite possible to build a center or even a left of center argument around the centrality of literacy and the empowerment that comes with literacy. Indeed, I shall be making a similar argument in a later slide. It reflects commercial interest. Well, not necessarily. I think one of the things that I'd like to say is that teaching literacy well doesn't need that many expensive additional resources. It needs books, it needs understanding, it needs certain resources, but it doesn't have to involve commercial interests. Indeed, I would encourage us to be careful of commercial interests in any of this. I'll be talking to you a little bit later on about a resource that I developed, co-developed, called Abracadabra, which is entirely free. So it's not necessary, and it involves phonics, of course. It needn't necessarily reflect commercial interests. Equally, it doesn't need to involve basal reading schemes. Lots of programs out there use wonderful children's literature, and I certainly think there's a very strong case for using quality children's literature from the very start, linked to any work that we do around reading. I've heard people say that phonics is inherently boring, so we shouldn't teach it. That's an interesting statement, because that would then imply that anything that was boring wouldn't be taught in any way in schools. So we only teach interesting things. That clearly can't be the case. But I think we can challenge the notion that phonics is inherently boring. It depends on how you do it. I'm going to give you some examples, I think, of ways that it can be done in extremely stimulating ways. And I'm going to encourage the view that understanding how our spelling system works is a process of discovery, of trial and error, of testing and theorizing. It's very much a piece of active learning, and it needs to be construed in that way and can be set up in that way in the classroom in ways that's highly engaging for young people. How about the claim that it works only for some children? Again, one hears this. There's not actually any terribly clear evidence that that's the case. And it goes hand in hand with the idea that somehow that there's a sort of a smorgasbord of alternative ways that one can pick up that would be equally as effective. And that's definitely, there's no evidence that that's the case. What about this resigned philosophical fashion argument? Well, I think children deserve better than that. I think we have made progress in understanding what works and what doesn't work. And I think children need to benefit from that. It would be a very sad, I think, situation if we simply just go around repeating these cycles of emphasis. Perhaps we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So I think it is appropriate to think of reading as a right, as a human right. because literacy is one early gateway to social and political opportunity. It's not the only thing that gets someone there, but it is, of course, a very important gatekeeper. Literacy and power over language is power, and therefore it's a path to equity for those who don't have power. It is, in that sense, an absolute moral responsibility to support literacy. And to have control over language is to set off on a very different life course, potentially. And we've learned that there are extremely important links between literacy and wider life outcomes, including physical health outcomes. So it's incredibly important that we get this right. It's a moral and political obligation, in my mind. And we also know that the historically and currently marginalized are less likely to read well. So children have a right to understand and use their spelling systems, the reading and spelling system, effectively. And to achieve this, we need to get our evidence right and undertake the sorts of reflection and interrogations that I've been thinking about. So that, I think, is a very powerful argument, and one that the Ontario Human Rights Commission have rightly made about the importance of reading in their report recently. We can go on to the next slide. So another argument that you hear about phonics is that English is too complex for phonics. That was certainly the argument that Frank Smith made, and it was the argument that Ken Goodman and others made. The printed page is just too unreliable. And some of the arguments that were made there were linguistic arguments. It was about the structure of written English. And in the 1960s, this issue was approached by educators like Goodman and by some linguists. But contemporary insights have taken this a little bit further. We can look at this issue about the complexity of English in a kind of computational way. And I'll speak on that in the next slide to say exactly what I mean. What I'm leading towards is the idea that children need to have, as it were, a working model in their heads of the spelling system. That's what we want them to do. We want them to be able to internalize this knowledge about words and their meanings and their place in sentences and their place in texts. And that they have this, if they have a conception of the process of reading, then they can understand English better and can aid the process of learning to read. So it's kind of building a model in their heads of the English spelling system. So if we can turn to the next slide. Well, let's look at, here's an example of a complexity for sure. This is a letter that appeared in the Times newspaper many decades ago. I'm going to read it to you. I take it you already know of tough and bow and cough and dough. Others may stumble, but not you, on hiccup, thorough, tough and through. Well done. And now you wish perhaps to learn of less familiar traps. Beware of herd, a dreadful word that looks like beard and sounds like bird. And dead, it's said like bed, not bead. For goodness sake, don't call it deed. Watch out for meat and great and threat. They rhyme with sweet and straight and debt. A moth is not a moth in mother, nor both in bother, broth in brother. And here is not a match for there, nor dear and fear for bear and pear. And then there's dose and rose and lose. Just look them up, and goose and choose. And cork and work and card and ward and font and front and word and sort. And do and go and thwart and cart. Come, come, I've hardly made a start. A dreadful language, man alive. I'd mastered it when I was 5. Well, I very much doubt that they mastered it when they were 5. But if we think about what's happening there, English is incredibly complicated. The spelling patterns there are very unreliable, as described in there, at all levels, both at the level of letters and sound, but also at larger levels. So this has led people to argue that the English spelling system is opaque. The patterns, relationships between letters and sounds are not transparent. You can't work them out. They're in a very imperfect guide, a bit like Goodman and others argued. But more recent scholars have said, well, okay, English, in fact, then is a language that represents morphemes, which are units of meaning, and phonemes, both of them rather imperfectly, as that last section showed. So it codes both of those simultaneously. It's a bit of a mess, in short. David Scher, one of the leading scholars around the world, said that English is an outlier orthography. It's like it's a really untypical spelling system compared to other alphabets. We now have good evidence that that's the case. Philip Seymour, who I knew from as my PhD, he was my PhD advisor back in the day, carried out some very interesting work comparing European spelling systems. And European spelling systems vary because there are spelling systems that are very transparent, very simple, like Finnish or Italian, German, Welsh is another one, where the patterns between graphemes, letters, and phonemes, sounds, are highly reliable. And Seymour was able to show that learning is demonstrably quicker in those languages. We turn to the next slide. So Seymour compared Scottish children, obviously learning English, and other European children. They didn't differ in their letter knowledge. Scottish children knew about a third of the match content and most of their European counterparts. By the end of P1, primary 1 in Scotland, which is about equivalent to grade 1, most of those European and Scandinavian children had 90% accuracy on these matched words, and well, pushing up to 100% shortly afterwards. Danish also has a somewhat more complex spelling system, was at 72% after the end of primary 1. The Scottish kids were back at 34% accuracy on these matched words. So English is really complicated. And you can see it when you look at the comparison of more simple complex spelling systems over more complex ones. And even by primary 2, that's about the end of grade 2, they're still at 76% accuracy on these words, which is below where the other European children were at the end of primary 1. So there's a lot of work to be done to learn English. It's extremely complicated. So definitely, so backing up the letter there, this backs up that data. English is messy, definitely. We have a look at the next slide. So English is messy and complicated, but complicated is not the same thing as impossible. So can we use phonic rules to work out how to read in English? Well, here you can take advantage of computation, as we were saying, as I mentioned earlier. So one of the earliest attempts was Hannah and colleagues back in the 60s. They used a very primitive computer, but for, as we would see it now, a very advanced one for their time. And they analyzed all the letter sound correspondences, grapheme phonemes. They found 17,000 words in a dictionary, and they coded them as graphemes and phonemes. And they ran a computer program to see how many words could be spelled correctly. And in sum, this analysis across all that words, that whole corpus of words, showed that word spelling was predictable from the pronunciations about 80% of the time. Indeed, there were very few words where there were no consistent graphemes. So even in a word that was unreliable, there are some that are consistent. So in this sense, English, yes, it's an outlier. Yes, it's messy, but it's not like, for example, Chinese, where there's no, where the only relationships that one has are units of meaning, and there are no letters. So the letters matter, and they do signal something important about consistent patterns. We go on to the next slide. So more recent corpus analysis also indicates some interesting patterns. So my colleague Jackie Masterson at the University of London analysed what she did really. Basically, she took popular children's books from kindergarten to grade 3. She found over 1,000 representative children's books, and she kind of shook out all of the words into a database. If you take out all the words from 1,000 beginner readers, you get something like 12,000 words. And when you do analysis on those 12,000 words to see what they're made up of, well, you find that the 100 most frequent words account for half of the tokens, half of the total. So this is a bit like teachers when they look at those high frequency word lists. They do occur very often, very, very often. There's a few words that occur extraordinarily often. Half of those high frequency words had exceptions to spelling rules within them. So these exceptionalities are actually kind of unrepresentative. They're occurring very often. They're unrepresentative of the total of the words in the language. And here's another thing that I'd like to share with you. Over half of all the words in that database occurred only once or twice across all texts. The majority of words in children's books occur once or twice across 1,000 books. That's an extraordinary task that children have to make sense of that. So a capable reader who is doing this in grade 2 or grade 3 is simultaneously reading texts and somehow acquiring all of those rare and low frequency words. They've got some kind of acquisition system, some kind of learning mechanism that they're doing this and adding and adding and adding to that little mental model of the spelling system. So I think we need to learn from that. I think that's an important piece for us to understand more. So if we can go on to the next slide. A few other things I'd like to share with you from this corpus analysis of quality children's literature. 32% of words in there were bisyllables. So we can't just focus on monosyllables. We've got 1 in every 3 words is a bisyllable. 5% of the words had 3 syllables, and just under 1% of words, 1 in every 100 or so, just under, had 4 or 5 syllables in them. So if we want children to read authentic literature, we've got to give them the skills and give them the experiences to allow them to get there with those words. Okay, so we've gone to the next slide. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit briefly about phonology. Phonology is the sound system of the language, of course. So we can think about a word, of course. We're familiar with words, and we're familiar with syllables. So take a word like black. It's a monosyllabic word. The syllable is black. We can break that syllable down potentially into what has been called the onset, which is the consonant cluster at the beginning of the word, and the rhyme. And that's not a spelling mistake. This is a technical use of the word rhyme, R-I-M-E, which is the vowel and terminal consonants. It's a linguistic concept, and it has been placed above the level of individual phonemes. In this case, the b, l, a, k, that represents the letter clusters. So a question that has been raised is whether we can use this higher onset rhyme level of understanding of phonology to help children read. Could that be a pathway in? We're going to turn to the next slide. Well, if we use that corpus of words again to make sense of this, my colleague Masterson's analysis showed that for these most commonly occurring words, there were about 87 different rhymes. Most of those rhymes only occurred once. So it's not likely that we can use rhyming patterns. Indeed, a close inspection of this data that I undertook showed that there were only 2 patterns, the an rhyme and the at rhyme, where you've got 4 or more consistent patterns. So that rhyming families are very rare in real books. They might be common in Dr. Seuss, but they're not very common in other texts beyond rhyming books. So the idea of rhyming with enough patterns to show the kind of valid transfer that we would want from them is very unlikely. So I'm going to suggest that rhyme analogy isn't likely to be the generative mechanism that's going to help children become self-teachers of the spelling system. Let's go on to the next slide. This is a key idea I'd like to introduce here. This is David Scher's idea. We met him earlier. And he talks about the role of phonics as a self-teaching tool. And he provides an important insight I wanted to share. When children apply grapheme, i.e. letter or letter cluster, to phoneme rules, to new words, they can pronounce them. So you can meet a word that you've never seen before, and you can sound it out and gain a pronunciation for that word. If you know the meaning of that word, you can link that pronunciation to the meaning that you already have. And sometimes children will have that meaning because their oral language skills are in advance of their written skills, generally speaking. So these opportunities to sound out a word are opportunities to store the spelling of these words. But that's speculation until Scher ran a study. a very influential study where what he did is he deliberately used made-up words, pseudo words, because he didn't want to contaminate the study with the possibility that some children knew the words. But this applies to real word learning. It isn't about pseudo words. So what he did is he introduced children to a text which they read. These were children in grades 2 and grade 3, and they were readers. They read a text about the coldest city in the world, and then they met Yate in the context of this description of the coldest city in the world. So they just read it. Subsequently, David Sher and his colleagues introduced children to these alternative spellings of Yate that you can see there, the AIT and the ATE. And he asked children to make a judgment. Which one is the Yate that you saw? And children were very good at identifying the one that they saw, the AIT version. Indeed, even after reading these texts once or twice, up to a month later, some studies have shown this ability to remember that stored word-specific information. So what? What does this mean? What this means is that when children are applying their phonics, that this is an opportunity for storing information about the spelling system that they then can place into their longer term memories and that they then have available in the task of reading stepping forward. So it really underpins this idea that we can use phonics as a self-teaching resource. It's a route into independence, and it's a route into understanding the spelling system. Okay, so we're going to jump to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to get the last thing I want to deal with on this piece about the arguments that sometimes be made against phonics is, does it work? So a good way, if you're interested in large numbers of students, if you're interested in policy questions, or if you're interested in practice in schools as a general approach, is to think about, well, I'll answer questions about does it work, is to run what are known as training studies. What that really means is that one group of children are taught using a particular approach, in this case phonics, and another group of children have their regular business as usual practice that perhaps didn't involve phonics. Those two groups of children are matched or randomized, like in a randomized trial. Half are taught phonics, half are not. And then you can look at the impacts on reading subsequently. So that's the methodology. That's an intervention or training study methodology in essence. And it's a good way of answering questions about whether phonics works or not. So what happens when you look at studies like that? Well, you can look at individual studies. One of the things that happens in research is that effects are not always repeated across studies. So they're not always replicated. So there's sometimes a bit of a challenge in science of getting results time after time that are unreliable. So to ensure against that problem, a technique called meta-analysis is used, where you search the entire literature, all the works that have ever been published that have run these sorts of trainings in schools with young children. And meta-analysis is now a very well-known technique. And we've synthesized together recently 14 separate meta-analyses, which involve thousands of children worldwide looking at these questions. So what do they show? All 14, every single one of them showed us a positive immediate effect of phonics on typical or atypical readers, on immigrant learners, or second language learners. So robust effects, reliable effects over time. However, the effects were small to medium in size. That means that in terms of their practical implications, they're there, but they weren't large effects. They were small to medium. And we don't know much about any of the specifics. We don't know about one particular approach over another. We don't know much about the duration, etc., the specifics of the teaching. What we do know is that those effects were strongest when they were occurring for phonics that was within a wider and quite high quality language program, and indeed where tutoring took place. Finally, there is fairly reliable data from the same studies on the positive effects of phonics 1 year after the phonics teaching had finished, so into year 2. But we don't have much beyond that. That's an area of unknown. So I want to signal that as an area that we don't know much about. We'll hop on to the next slide. Another source of information that you might be interested in, this is called a structural equation model. And basically what this does is it follows children over time. It's a design where on the left-hand side, you've got letter knowledge, phonemes, and vocabulary and grammar. And on the right-hand side, you've got decoding, word reading, and reading comprehension. And so the children on the left-hand side, they picked them up when the children were in kindergarten and in grade 1. And on the right-hand side, the same children are now in grade 2 and grade 3. So do their performances early when they're young predict what happens when they are older? And this is a summary, not just of one study, this is an analysis of 64 studies that followed children over time. This is what they found. They found that letter knowledge and sensitivity to phonemes, that they called code-related skills, predicted word reading when children were in grade 2 and grade 3, which in turn predicted their reading comprehension. Wider language skills when the children were in kindergarten, vocabulary abilities and their grammatical skills, which seem to cluster together in something called linguistic comprehension or language skill, directly predicted reading comprehension. And reading comprehension is, if you like, the product of both of those things: skill in word reading, accuracy in word reading, and wider language. So again, we've got that message about phonics situated within, important, but situated within wider language. So can we go on to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so next thing I wanted to spend a little bit of time on was thinking about the adequacy of theorizing. So the argument against phonics has been based upon the idea that there are cues, this idea that, that the print is unreliable and that other cues are used to read words. So the syntactic structure and the sentence, the meanings of words, background knowledge, etc. And the idea that we have to do a lot of guessing and predicting. Well, is that really a plausible model? It was a model from the 1960s, but is it really a plausible model of the reading process in 2022? Well, let's have a look at this idea of guessing from context. I'm going to show you a text from Frank Smith where he talks about guessing. So you have some context. You know about this idea that guessing and working out and trying to make sense of a text using all of these cues is an important part. And I've taken some words out. So if we can go on to the next slide. So I've given you a chance to have a go at reading that. I randomly pulled 30% of the words from Frank Smith's text. I'm fairly sure that most people found that not a straightforward task to read those words. I'm going to point out that I didn't take out all the long words. I took out randomly. So some of those words, some of the longer words there for a struggling reader, obviously would be the ones they'd really struggle with, identification and demonstration and the like. So it's unlikely that we can just use context. In fact, estimates suggest we could probably make sense of about 10% of text at most if we use context. If we can go on to the next slide, just very quickly, that's what it looks like. That's the passage that I showed you. Okay, so we'll hop on to the next one. I'm going to show you what contemporary models of reading look like. I'm going to start off with models of word reading. This is the triangle model. And in a triangle model, the meanings of words are very important. This ability to decode and use phonics is very important. Understanding of the spelling system is very important. And importantly, all of these three work together in a very dynamic way. So why should we choose this model over alternatives? Well, this isn't just a model that's been put together with boxes and arrows. This is a model that's based on computational work. So what's been done here is not that a program has been run, but rather that a system has been built, an artificial intelligence system, a computer that can learn. And then what you do is you establish meanings and spellings and decoding units within it, and then you give the computer experience, a bit like a parent or a teacher gives a child experience. And then you look to see, does the system learn? Well, the answer is yes, it does. It learns by error, of course, just like human beings do, but gradually gets better and better, and its performance starts to look like a rule-based system. It finds words that are easy to decode, regular words much easier in the first instance than words that don't follow the rules, but eventually it catches up and makes sense of all of those words. So it's an operationalized model that actually does learn to read as a computer. So, children are not computers, clearly. There's a lot more to it. But as a metaphor, this is a very powerful next step in looking at what models are likely to look like. They can involve these things, and they can compute how words read in ways that are perhaps something like the way children may. I'm going to turn to the next slide. Okay, I'm just sharing that. I won't get into this for detail, but I'm just want to give you an example of what a contemporary model of reading comprehension looks like. This is Charles Perfetti's lexical quality hypothesis. I won't go into all the detail here, but what you'll see here on the left-hand side is visual input, and orthography and phonology, i.e. letters and sounds, word identification, meanings are really important. But then within this, there are processes supporting comprehension. There's general knowledge. There's knowledge of the linguistic and writing system above that, that all come in and work together to help understand comprehension. That's probably going to be more like an authentic contemporary account of reading and reading comprehension from a cognitive perspective, at least. Okay, I'm going to the last piece I wanted to talk here about models. One of the things that we know with some certainty after several decades of careful work, we think about the foundations of phonics. It probably involves two things, at least two things. One is the knowledge of the letter sounds that are relevant, and it involves phoneme awareness. Some of you who are teachers might have had the frustrating experience of teaching children letter sounds, and for the children to seem to know them, but not actually to be able to use them to read any words. You do meet children like this sometimes. It's quite possible that those children are currently lacking in their phoneme awareness. And there's lots of good evidence that this phonological awareness is a key part of the process. If we look at children in the kindergarten phase, just at the point where they start to begin to decode, it's exactly at the point where they show phoneme awareness and letter sound knowledge week on week. We've also been running some studies last year and the year before where we taught children letter sounds, and the children who benefited most from that experience, guess what, were the children who had strong phonological awareness in the first instance. So it's probably both of those things that we need to support phonics. So I just wanted to draw attention to that because sometimes the phoneme awareness piece is missed out. And I think it's particularly the case for children who struggle with reading that they may benefit from the phoneme awareness support there. Okay, we're going to the next slides. I'm just going to overview here, especially with an eye on how we're progressing in terms of time, that a few suggestions around best practices. Just a few things that I've seen work well, gently suggested to you. One of the things that I've seen working very well is the idea that little and often is very helpful. Sometimes people argue phonics is getting in the way. Little and often can be very helpful. This is the idea of distributed learning. Another way to do this is set up a theme of the week, like a letter sound, encouraging children to predict and problem solve, but not guess. We can go on to the next slide. Thank you. Few suggestions here. I won't read through all of them, but here are some things that I like when I think of engaging phonics activities. I think of positive classroom atmosphere, fun, high on task, engagement, careful assessment, monitoring, lots of multisensory stuff going on, lots of use of sand, balloons, letters, writing letters on your back and guessing what they are. Phonics Twister is a fantastic fun game. Pace, laughter, humor. These are the sorts of things I like to see in active learning with phonics, particularly in the early years. We'll go on to the next slide. A few other things that I think are very important. We've talked about the importance of quality real books. I think active participation means for pupils means heavily differentiated plans. We need to make sure that these are tasks that all can succeed with. So this idea of differentiated learning is absolutely crucial. And learning to read, I think, for words in the early phase is very much about these linkages, these connectivities. So we need to make sure that when children are doing their work with phonics, that's connecting them up to books very closely, and to the process of reading and to the task of reading, and so the children can make that connection. Anything we do in the way of assessment has to be quick and efficient in this frame. So a few ideas there. We'll go on to the next slide. One or two last things I'll mention here. Blending and segmenting for phonology seems to be particularly important. There's no evidence, by the way, that children need to be shielded from some of the complexities of these letter-sound correspondences. There's a notion that you should start with a single letter. So maybe right at the beginning you should. But the complexities of English mean that these letter clusters are met very early on, and children are better off being guided with those than trying to work them out for themselves. There's no evidence on what works best in terms of some of this detail, but we clearly those are the realities of the spelling system. You use multiple formats, and you might consider using technology like the tool Abracadabra, which I'll mention a little bit later. Okay, let's rattle along. Yeah, just to say that you could think about sequences, starting with the simplest, moving on to the more complex. In the interest of time, we'll run on ahead to the next piece here. I wanted to make this very important point. I've already said that there's clear evidence that working with the spelling system in English requires attention to phonics for children who don't have phonics skills already. However, a key observation that I want to share is that there's no evidence that more teaching of phonics to children who can already self-teach using phonics is of any value. If children can undertake phonic tasks, if they can use those to derive pronunciations and meanings of words, if they can do that independently, then the best thing for them is to have the exposures that allow them to explore the spelling system and literature and the task of learning with a degree of independence. Strong work by the late Carol Connor and colleagues showed very clearly that there's an optimal fit. In their research, stronger readers progressed more in child-directed tasks, and weaker readers progressed more in teacher-directed instruction. So it depends on what the children are bringing in the early years. So there's no one-size-fits-all for phonics. That's a really important point I wanted to make. Some children who've already got it, lucky them. They don't need lots and lots more to drive that message home if they're already reliably using it. I would argue that the ability to self-teach with phonics is likely the key indicator of readiness towards moving to this greater and greater independence. Okay, go on to the next stage. I'm going to argue then that phonics is a really important part of reading, but it's necessary but not sufficient. But we're also likely to need things like instruction and support and experience in morphology, which is the meaning-based units in language, and it's likely to involve strategy situated in wider language with proactive preventative assessment and early intervention in inclusive, high expectation, equitable classrooms. And it's that kind of complex and multi-component work that I think we're looking to do now as reading researchers in supporting schools. We can go on to the next slide. So, wanted to share one or two things that we've been doing that are new, but I think are interesting and relevant. One of the ideas that we've been playing with is the idea that rules are sometimes too complex for children when these rules are very inconsistent. So ED, for example, ED has different pronunciations in wanted, slipped, and walked. We could attempt to try and teach a rule for that situation, but we might be better off and we might be more efficient if we teach children a strategy of making sense when the phonic rules don't quite apply. So if they do sound out a word and they come off, they pronounce it as walked, that they've got a strategy for adjusting that so that they can find the word that's represented by their decoding, rather than trying to teach what would be hundreds of complex and highly conditional rules for the spelling system. So we argue that problem-solving heuristics or problem-solving approaches are also needed as well as phonics. Okay, can go on to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so building on this idea, teachers and very often policymakers are implicit what you might call dual root theorists. They think there are two ways to read words. One is this grapheme phoneme or phonic pattern, which is represented down the right-hand side. And the other approach on the left-hand side is a formal representation of the idea that children might learn words by sight. Sight words and phonics have been the approach in classrooms around the world for decades. It might be the approach that people's grandparents learned with. But is this a good system? Well, let's have a look at the next slide to advance this idea. As we know, English has many high-frequency words, many of them that don't follow those phonic rules, as we've already been considering. If we try teaching those exception words by sight, this is very inefficient. It's effortful and slow. The danger is it produces shallow word knowledge, unless we do even more work. And more importantly, it doesn't produce a generalizable strategy. It doesn't give you a way for reading other sight words. It gives word-specific information. So this is a challenge for if we're going to teach children hundreds of words. If we go on to the next slide. Furthermore, most of these words that are considered exception words, exceptions to the phonic rules, that is, are not exception words at all. They have exceptional parts in them. So I took some so-called exception words, and I coloured in red those correspondences that don't follow fairly standard phonic rules. About half of the letter sound correspondences in these exception words do follow the phonic rules. So even here, the patterns from phonics are relevant, but we obviously clearly need to do something else to help children make sense of and learn these exception words and many others. So what can we do? We go on to the next slide. Thank you. So I present a little diagram here, so it might give you a little bit of a picture. This is based on Linnea Eerie's work, early work. She talks about the idea that, like I said earlier, there's two roots. One you might call a semantic root. You see the word wasp. If you know the word wasp, you've got a perception of it, and it connects up to your mental knowledge about wasps. And for most of us, unless we're biologists, a wasp is an intrusion on enjoying ice cream on a sunny day. And we know the pronunciation of that. But very often what happens is children have come across the word wasp, they've come across the concept of wasp. They've had an ice cream, lucky them. They know about wasps. They know the word, its pronunciation at least, they don't know the printed word when they come to school. And they sound it out. So they meet this word and they quite rightly, having applied their phonic rules, sound it out and produce wasp. So that doesn't get them anywhere if they are inflexible. If they're simply following the phonic rules, it gets them to a dead end. This is a word that doesn't follow the rules. However, if children have mental flexibility and know that these phonic rules sometimes need to be played with and adjusted and tinkered with a little bit to allow you to get a pronunciation, they might be able to make the jump from wasp to wasp, especially if they're that word is met in a supportive context. That's the idea of self-correction. And I think this is a very powerful mechanism. And we have some evidence now to show that that's the case. If we can go on to the next slide. Okay. we've got this rather grand name for it. We didn't create this, but others use this, so we use it here. It's called mispronunciation correction. And it's the idea that if children have their phonics, they practice their phonic blending, and they've practiced some mental flexibility. And we've used some fun games like Simon Says, some oral games with young children in the classroom where they're doing Simon Says kind of activities with words that are manipulated like that to build flexibility for the pronunciations. And if they know the meanings of these words, then they can derive even the exception words using the phonic rules, and they're taught. So we've used this to encourage, we've done sort of head, shoulders, knees and toe and movements and things like this. We've made it very, very active for young children. And we've gone in and we've taught children in classrooms. So what happens if you do this? If we go on to the next slide. Well, this is our strategy. There's our strategy card, mispronunciation correction. That's our simple version for children to refer to. Sound out the word. Is this a word? If it isn't, flip the sound around, manipulate it, work it out from the sentence, say it and write it. So a little strategy card that the children have on their desk. We go on to the next slide. Here's an example of a simple text that we could use to illustrate this idea. I have a new kite, says the teacher. This could be a shared text. It has a monkey on it. A monkey, perhaps. The monkey flies in the sky, has a big smile. The monkey is holding a fruit. The fruit is long and yellow. It is a banana. You get the idea is that children attempt to make sense of it, and then if they can't make sense of it, you can introduce the picture there, and then children have a context for this and could see the connection between those regular phonic pronunciations and the word that they're trying to find, and encouraging flexibility. So if you do this over time with stories and activities, there are impacts. If we go on to the next slide. Thank you. So here's our results of a study. We ran this with 100 struggling readers in Montreal and in Alberta a few years ago. This is our scores on a reading test. These children should have reading scores, standard scores of 100, but they don't because they're struggling readers. They started the year on the red bar with scores around 75. And what you'll see on the left-hand side is our flexible phonics, our flexibility program, and the controls who got best practices, actually another intervention, but which didn't include this. So they started the year with lowish scores. By the time they got to the end of December, their teachers had got their standard scores up. The teachers were doing a good job. We came in to provide some additional help after the break, and we measured them again at the end of the grade 1. And you can see from that green, the sort of the third column on the flexible side, that column's got up as far as 100. So they've become quite close to typical readers. The control group are still not quite there, they're below 90. And then we followed up those group of struggling readers, the same groups in grade 2, is 5 months after we'd finished teaching them. Do these effects still maintain? With the dark green bar showing the scores there up to about 95 for the intervention group, and for the control groups, they are a little bit lower, and that's still a significant difference. So we're able to provide evidence that this mental flexibility in using phonics is a bit more effective than teaching sight words, which is what the control group got. Move on to the next slide. Okay. Just wanted to say, I'm going to summarize this very quickly, that the transfer effects there, essentially we looked at this in Quebec. So we looked at the impact on French, because those children were also involved in French immersion. And we found an effect in French as well. It seemed to transfer, even though none of the intervention was delivered in French. So it does seem to be that once you learn this strategy for mental flexibility, you can apply it in somewhat complicated alphabetic systems like French. So that's a very important piece. And these are struggling readers. So we're very surprised by this result, but it seems to be fairly robust. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide, I think. Yeah, so here I just wanted to say that I think there's really good evidence that what we do early on has a big impact upon children's literacy. And I've been doing this sort of work for many, many years, working with schools. If we work together to help identify children who might need early support, provide appropriate interventions, a very large number of those children can reach age-appropriate levels of reading. And I think even in those cases where it doesn't improve children's reading, it provides clear evidence that it's not because of the absence of appropriate learning experiences. So I'll move on to the next slide. I thought I would stand here and just say very briefly, I guess this is one for policymakers out there, but it's also, I guess, one for teachers and for anybody who wants to know what the impact of the early education is on the life course. This is James Heckman's economic analysis of the impacts of early intervention. And we don't usually think about this. We don't particularly need to think about it if we just want to improve reading. But there is nevertheless a very powerful argument for early intervention based upon the return that one gets for this. If you intervene and support children effectively in preschools and in early schools and in the early years context, there are very large impacts. And so those impacts upon development are typically much larger than those that you see in later phases of life. So I just wanted to share that our interventions sit within work of that kind. Okay, we'll pop on to the next slide. You know what we might do? Actually, we'll skip this one. Can we go on to the next one, please, Kate? Thank you. I wanted just a final note in thinking about this piece on phonics on the usefulness of data from these corpuses. Some of you may have come across or even used the Jolly Phonics scheme. It's quite a good scheme. It was very popular, has been very popular. These are the letter sound correspondences that it emphasizes in the first instance. I think there's 42 of them, something like that. It's a reasonable number of those. So imagine a child has been exposed to that. They've diligently learned them. They've been hardworking. Are they ready to read? Can they use this? Well, let's assume that those letter sounds are known, and child then wants to, if we go to the next slide, engage with their favorite author. Let's say it's Robert Munch, and a young girl is excited to read about the paper bag princess who takes no nonsense and can deal with ridiculous dragons. And she's read this book. She wants to read it herself. And if we go on to the next slide, she's worked hard on her Jolly Phonics. That's what the first page of the, well, not the first, but a page of the paper bag princess looks like, even with those grapheme phonemes. Okay, so is that because there's something funny in that book? Let's do the same analysis with the next slide. So this is the wonderful book, Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are. This is the first page of Where the Wild Things Are, with those letter sound correspondences. That's still a pretty tough read, isn't it? Okay. Doesn't get much easier, even if you add in the next slide. A few sight words. Doesn't really help. We'll go on to the next slide. There we are. There's the text. There's the beautiful text that we want children to read and share with children. So my point there is that because of this complexity in English, it's going to take a while for children to be able to do some of this stuff. And they're going to need a fair amount of grapheme phoneme knowledge and phonic rules. Let's go on to the next slide. Again, I'm going to take you to this idea of corpus analysis. My colleague, Janet Velston, looked at the relationship between the number of letter sound rules that children have been taught and how much of text they could read. So again, she did a corpus analysis, pulled out loads and loads of children's books, and then analyzed, if you knew these 20, 40, 60 or 80 letter sound rules, how much of the text can you read? And what you can see here is a graph that shows what you might call diminishing returns. That oval at the top shows that it's really important to learn these letter sound rules if you want to be able to read the text. But once you get beyond about 65, you start getting diminishing returns. But you probably do need to learn something like those 65 most commonly occurring rules to be able to use to make sense of English. The rest, you're going to have to do some creative stuff like our mispronunciation correction, perhaps. Let's have a look at some of those additional grapheme phonemes in the next slide. Those are some of the patterns that come up very often in Janet's analysis and Jonathan Soliti's analysis of texts. Those are commonly occurring patterns in real books. Okay. Next, we'll go on to the next slide. Thank you. Oh. We can go on to the next one. Thanks. Last few comments I'd just like to make here, and this is an important one before I draw to a close. I've spent most of this evening with your patients talking about the spelling system and talking about words and sometimes about vocabulary. But I started off by saying how important comprehension is. I wanted to talk about words because it has had so much attention and is garnering so much attention within the Ontario context currently. But equal emphasis needs to be placed upon comprehension. There are plenty of things that we can do to support comprehension. I'd just like to share some of this quickly before we close. Okay, oh, so we've got to scroll down. If we can click on the buttons there, Kate. Yeah, we've got a slightly different format here. There are lots and lots of things that we know can be done to support children's comprehension, discussion and collaboration, use of pictures, imagery, lots of active learning and links to those experiences, self-directed speech, strategies like summarizing, questioning, clarifying, predicting, the notion of story grammars, looking at patterns across texts and comparisons, asking children good questions that they have to elaborate on. Click on the next slide. Evidence also shows lots of background knowledge is very important. So the children have to construct a micro world, if you like. So like very young children who get involved in something like, get interested in dinosaurs or something, they create a micro world that really allows them to elaborate their understanding in that little domain. So if we're to build understanding, we need to build these micro worlds as the basis for our work around comprehension. Vocabulary is crucial, work on morphology is crucial, direct instruction in language structures, things like reasoning and inference and strategies, as well as some of the motivational and attributional aspects of learning are really important. Alongside rich apprenticeship learning will be this language-rich environment that we've been hinting at. That's absolutely crucial. You might want to consider a very popular piece from some years ago as reciprocal teaching, discussion groups. These are some semi-independent groups of young children who work together to collectively problem solve. That seems to be a very, very effective way of supporting learning and development. So all that I've said about phonics and the print sits alongside these important aspects of language. We'll pop on to the next slide. And as an illustration of this, I just wanted to share with you Abracadabra. This is the tool. This is the splash page for our free access, nothing for sale here, free access, entirely free, evidence-based, effective reading program that has both a word level, phonic part of it, of course, with these sounds, letters, words and phonological awareness and all these sorts of things, but also has a heavy focus on, an equal focus upon texts and language and comprehension. We can go to the next slide. So here are some examples of our comprehension activities, some vocabulary here. This is our story ordering, discussions, and in all of the text, we can go on to the next slide. All the text that we use, these are authentic children's books with each of them carefully mapped against strong comprehension strategies. So equal focus, a genuinely balanced resource in that regard. So what happens if you take that and you take it to a context like I was in until quite recently in the UK, where there was a heavy focus primarily on phonics only in the early years. If we go on to the next slide, I'll show you. Well, this is what happens. And bear with me, I've showed you a complex diagram just for the end, but I just wanted to make this point. We find effects. So if you run a program that's balanced, has an early focus on comprehension and decoding, which you can see there on the left-hand side, this will impact their later decoding and their later comprehension. Very importantly, there's the thing that's called program at the bottom in this statistical model, shows how we got that extra effect. The way we got an effect on children's reading in grade 1 and grade 2 was directly through both the comprehension, their improved ability to understand spoken and written text, and through their decoding, their ability to sound out words, use phonics, and to work at the word level. And those two fed through directly in their UK in English national test results. So we're able to demonstrate the importance of the balance in literacy across whole classrooms of children. So we think that that's powerful evidence of the importance of balance. We'll go on to the last couple of slides before we're finishing off. So just if you can just click again, Kate. Okay. So if you think about this idea of balance, and we're thinking about assessment, this suggests we need to think about where an individual child is in a sort of two-dimensional space like this, for a simple model at least. So they're a bit, where are they where is a child in terms of their ability to decipher text, to decode? Are they low or are they high, or somewhere in between? But we also need to be asking, where are they in their language? Where are they low or high in their language comprehension? If they're high in deciphering and low in comprehension, they could be invisible. We need to be careful we don't miss these children in classrooms. Equally, if they're high in comprehension and low in deciphering, that's like the classic case of the classic dyslexic profile, isn't it? But I also want to draw attention to the children who might be low on both. And we do meet, unfortunately, children who have poor language skills and poor word reading, and they need twice as much effort. They need twice as much attention and arguably twice as much resource because they've got two issues that need to be attended to as firmly as possible. So I think there's some power here in thinking about these sorts of things. Last couple of slides to finish off. Wanted to talk about all this and situate it within a wider context. I've been talking about process quite a lot, but I never lose sight of the fact that as teachers, as we work in you work in complex contexts with peer groups, with the background knowledge, with the curriculum, students, homes and families, and the wider context. So all of those issues can be brought to bear in thinking about literacy. I haven't spoken about those. They haven't been my primary focus. And it doesn't mean that those things are not important. They are extremely important. We can go to the next slide. Okay, conclusion time. We concluded our review of the research on reading with this quote, which I'd like to just share with you. We would say that the appropriate question to ask of a 21st century science of teaching is not the superiority of phonics versus alternative reading methods, including whole language and balanced literacy, but how best to combine different components of evidence-based instruction into an integrated and customized approach that addresses the learning needs of each child. We need to look at what individual children need. This requires balance within classrooms. It involves understanding those models that we've been talking about, knowing children really well, thinking about dynamic and formative assessments to shape teaching. And I'm going to argue that this is consistent with child-centered pedagogy, but it's not consistent with those old binary, adversarial phonics versus whole language debates that have plagued the literature for decades, the great debate, if you like. I think it's time that we need to move the dial there towards individual children's needs. It's going to be a combination, not one to the exclusion of others. Last slide, please. So I started off with the idea that reading is complex. I hope you had some sense, though, but not too much about how complex it is. I think we do need to embrace some of the complexity, but I also think that we've made real progress in understanding how reading develops. And I also believe, as a researcher practitioner, that there's much that can be done with these insights and with teachers as experts in their own classrooms and in their own children to together improve outcomes for youth. And I'm hopefully we'll have an opportunity to work with you at some point in the future. I hope you found that of interest. I hope you found that useful. I'll be delighted to take questions at this point. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Dean Savage, for your talk and for sharing the research that you do and with the partners that you've done that with. As you were speaking, there were questions coming in already, so I think people were thinking alongside with you, which is fantastic. I'd like to invite people who are still digesting some of the thoughts that Rob shared to take that time and use the Q&A button at the bottom to drop in your question, and I'll do my best to reflect back as many of them as I can. As people are working with adding a question, I can go to the ones that might have that were raised at the in the middle of the talk as you were speaking. There are some questions about how your research might help people think about children and young people who are English language learners. I know you addressed the French. Is there a way you can talk a little bit about English language learning children in relation to the strategies you've shared?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, there was a part of the piece that I presented at one point about what we know about the impact of phonics certainly suggests that it works with measurable effect for children who come from an English language learning background. There's reliable evidence on that. So in terms of the broad piece about phonics, there's some good evidence that it's likely to be sort of reasonably successful. However, of course, as children who are English language learners, they're not one group, first of all. Some children who come as English language learners come with skills in their first language. There's some evidence actually that if you come from a language that has a more consistent spelling system, you might actually be advantaged over English first language speakers, at least to some degree. So there might even be some advantages occasionally. Ultimately, the ability to use multiple languages will be an incredible advantage, not just in life, but actually in terms of your likely ability to really be the master or mistress of your language in English and your first language. So the two probably interact in important ways. So it's most definitely an advantage. Children take time; they need time. There's always a phase with their wider learning where they need lots of exposure, where they may not be able to say too much. That when they're being immersed in a language, and their brains are really undertaking some incredible computations to make sense of this new input and this new experience. And children are incredibly powerful at doing this. Our brains are amazing resources. But children do need time. They need strong exposure, lots of immersion, lots of opportunities to be able to express themselves in ways that are appropriate to them at the point that they are able to engage, and with high expectation. They will come through and do really, really well in very, very many cases. I hope that helps a little bit. I haven't spoken about language comprehension in the second language. That would be a separate, a whole other piece, I think.
Yeah, some other questions that are somewhat related in the sense that it looks like there's a question here about what it would mean for deaf children to engage in phonetics, and a comment that there's a different kind of challenge there for those learners.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting case, isn't it? I think well, two things. One is that there are a whole, again, range of children within that cluster the deaf community. Some have partial hearing, some have intermittent loss, some have had hearing and then lost it. So it depends upon the individual characteristics of the child in some regard, and the context that they operate in. And I think it depends upon wider issues about preference, about mode of communications. It's a complicated piece there, and the community have quite rightly been very organized around the world in making sure that complexity is understood. In terms of phonics, well, there has been some work around thinking about phonics and with children who experience deafness, with mixed effect. There are other cues that one can use. Obviously, there are the mechanical clues from the mouth as well as the sounds that have some impact. But I'm not going to say here tonight that I would want to advocate for any one position over another when it comes to deaf children.
Thank you. There's a question here about whether or not, or how you could comment on how your research might have accounted for another variable in addition to the strategies you're talking about, which might be the quality of the teacher who is enacting the program or the plan or the lesson. So is there something about attentive individualized instruction that is another kind of factor that you might want to account for in thinking about these different approaches?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so one of the things I didn't mention in the talk is that you can do those studies, those intervention studies, those teaching studies in different ways. One of the ways that you can do this is that you can, and we did this in the data that I showed you, was that I trained graduate students to go in to schools and do these, run these lessons as additional to the regular classroom teaching that was taking place there. So all the attention there was making sure that the students were really clear. And you can do certain sorts of things there. One of the students had a leading role when it was going around and sort of with a sort of tick list to make sure things were done in the ways that we hoped they were being done. And that's the fidelity of the program, if you like. And there's a whole technology behind that. So we think that was done reasonably well with that study. But then it's a somewhat artificial thing because it doesn't actually speak to what happens when teachers do things in real classrooms. So I'm always very keen to look at how we support professional development with teachers in programs that are likely to add value for children. And there it's a complex thing. I think we have to embrace some of the variability and the complexity. Teaching excellence will be a really important part of this. But teachers don't always necessarily want to follow an intervention that they're given to the letter of the law. They may already have things that they value. It's a complex meeting space between, I think, universities and school boards. And I think we will make more progress here when we embrace that complexity. One of the things I did in a study we ran last year in the pandemic, we ran this flexible program in 120 schools, 5,000 children were involved, enormous. So that allowed us to look at the 60 schools that ran the program. The randomization idea helps if you get an overall effect of the approach compared to the controls. The process of randomization helps to rule out some of those other explanations of the overall pattern of results, because if you're randomly allocating up overall and the groups are large enough, then variations on other things are in a sense controlled. Nevertheless, teaching is, and how teachers engage with professional development is a really key area. And I think it's extremely interesting. And I think we could do a better job than, and I say we, myself, and the literature could do a better job of linking the needs and interests and motivations and approaches of teachers, practicing teachers, and those of people who come in to run any program, whether it's reading or math or social development or anything. You know, we've got to have something that has a greater connectivity, and not just assume that if we turn up on Monday from the university that everyone's going to be waiting and eager to hear every word and make instant changes to everything they've done. That's naive, I think. So I think this is where the partnership comes, and I think this is where universities have to listen to teachers and to schools and understand their agendas as well.
A related question to your last point there is a question about what you would suggest is the most essential learning for teacher candidates who are seeking certification in the primary division in regards to reading instruction.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think here, what we want to make sure is that teachers, I taught a course for many years on reading, the teaching of reading, it was called, at McGill, with the B.Ed students. That 13 weeks went past incredibly quickly. So if I tried to jam in everything I thought was really useful into those 13 weeks, it would just be throwing information at teachers. And I'm not sure that's the most useful thing. I think we have to help teachers think about, the teachers in training, about what we do know about the spelling system. So I think some version of the sorts of things that I've said to you there tonight would be part of it. But I also think this notion of active learning and teachers' exploration of the practice and the spaces is absolutely crucial, and that it's a lifelong task, to be keeping up to date and reflecting both on your practice, but keeping up to date on what we know about what's likely to be effective, attending professional development where relevant, other wider supports for professional learning, and communities of practice, and other important activities that happen out in schools and in communities more widely. So I think we set the ball rolling. I think the teachers do benefit from some understanding of the nature of the spelling system, with opportunities to then explore and learn from each other in dynamic ways. So I used to do things like run lots and lots of group work, lots of poster sessions, lots of getting teachers to explore and evaluate technologies and resources, because teachers need to have a critical sense of whether something works or doesn't work or is appropriate, or these sorts of things. So those are kinds of things that I always thought were important for student teachers in reading, and also to connect it up to the wider issues that they consider across their Bachelor of Education course, the way that equity issues, language issues, cultural issues, and other content domains, mathematics, geography, history, humanities, the sciences, are connected spaces for using those literacies. And we made that point really, I think, at the beginning as well. Literacy isn't just about reading books in the English class; it's about all of those contexts. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. These questions are quite deeply contextual and engaged with your work. So I'm trying to make sure I've captured as many as I can. There are some questions here about children who experience dyslexia, and how you might shift the strategy, or whether the strategy can be considered effective in that particular case, and if you have some thoughts to share about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that we know from the intervention research, those meta-analyses that I talked about, and I think some pretty well conducted studies over time now, is that phonics teaching is one of the few evidenced approaches for children who experience dyslexia, over other sorts of things. So most definitely, phonics instruction would be front and center in my first view, for someone who's struggling with reading. But we also know that other things are likely to be important. There's emerging research showing that the morphological aspects of language, those meaning clusters, the relationships between words that don't necessarily represent pronunciations consistently. There's a relationship between, nation and national, for example. Sign and signal, words like patterns like this. There are not consistent spelling pronunciations, but there are meaning connections, and that a sensitivity and awareness of those, stimulation of that within the context of reading and oral language does seem to be very important. There's been a lot of work over some years now accumulating on this. We've contributed to this recently. We've been running some morphology studies, and we do find effects. They're sometimes modest, but they're definitely there. We're seeing some patterns, as other people are there. So it may be that the morphology and the phonology of language are important aspects here. And I think a particular call, I think, has to be made where children who have had a diagnosis of dyslexia and have had lots of phonics intervention over many years, and that phonics teaching has been really good, but they're still struggling. The challenge then is to think, well, what next? Is it more of the same again, or what do we do in those contexts? So I think those are the challenges for me, but also to make sure those children and young people have their access to the wider curriculum. We mustn't losing sight of all the other things that are happening in the curriculum, where they may need likely to need additional supports, and where I think the future could be a strong place, where as technologies become better and better, there are resources that help support young people so that they can maintain and contribute their engagement in the wider curriculum without having to be kind of heroic in their efforts, which sometimes they have to be in this. So I'm keen that we keep an eye on that side as well. But yeah, I think phonics is likely to be an important part of the piece in the first instance. Yes.
There's a high-level question here about, is there anything you would add or change about the Right to Read report? It's kind of a blue sky question, as you
No,
might
that's
call
fine.
it.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I did submit a response to the Right to Read report. I think that's probably in the public domain. If it isn't, I understand it will be. I think my major caveat that I put in this evening around phonics is that it can't be absolutely one size fits all, because some children luckily come to school with phonics. I mean, some are just blessed with natural talent and just seem to arrive at school with it. Some have been taught and supported by parents. Some just pick it up very quickly. So when they've got to that point, we need to make sure that that they have the full opportunity to be exposed to the wider curriculum, that they're using that self-teaching strategy. That self-teaching strategy, if we understand the mechanisms, the self-teaching strategy is the tool that allows children to internalize the spelling system of English. So they get this through exposure to text, wide reading, lots of exposure. And so they need interesting and engaging tasks to get them into the wider reading of text. So it's exactly that point where they get to fly off to some extent, still obviously looked after very carefully by the teacher, keeping a close eye, but still reading to learn rather than learning to read, as it's sometimes been called. So I think that would be my major caveat about it, is about just making sure that it's sufficiently nuanced to the patterns that we see. And maybe just my last point there, children with language difficulties, particularly children who have language and reading difficulties, have incredible extra challenges to overcome. Not that they can't, but still, a lot that doesn't happen without a lot of work, and I wouldn't want them to be invisible.
Thank you very much. I can see the time, and I'm trying to make sure I've got most of the questions put to you. One question is asking you about how you might think about strategies or offer views on what could replace what was the reading recovery program in schools. And so, in a sense, again, more about what you might think about programmatically around support for children who might need different levels and kinds of support in reading and learning to read.
Yeah. I would be cautious about speaking about any individual program. I wouldn't want to align myself with any particular program. What I always say to people, and what I say to the student teachers actually, is you want to look at the principles behind that program, the content of the program, whether it aligns with our values, but also whether it aligns with evidence about effectiveness, and whether it's value for money. Some programs can have an impact, but are extraordinarily expensive. So we need to think about that. I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that the process of learning, actually the best resource is the teacher, and perhaps the second best resource is a range of interesting books, and then a few other things alongside. I'd add in some technologies and things like that. But actually, I think it's about understanding how children learn to read and the variations that we've talked about tonight. If you understand that, then you can build great programs. I'm not saying you have to invent them from scratch, but you can look at those in a number of different ways and build them, and we can accumulate them. And we certainly need to look at value for public money. So I think we need to look carefully at some of the most expensive ones for sure.
Thank you so much. I think we've got about 3 minutes left. If anyone has a question that they haven't had a chance to hear answered, or have thought of something in the late hours of the talk and would like to raise it before we go, I invite you to put it into the Q&A, and we can see if we can get one more question for Rob. It sounds like you're making a case for an attention to context and diversity and difference in an overall framework that is supportive of phonics, if I'm understanding as an audience member and what you've been articulating in your responses.
Yeah, I think phonics sits in there as an important piece. At a certain point in children's development, for children who need it, it's really crucial. And so yes, it's that nuance piece. I'm looking at what you might call individual differences, individual variation. I'm making sure that we give all children exactly what they need to help benefit from their experience in school. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, great. So it sounds, I mean, it seems like people have had their questions posed and responded to. And we are just 2 minutes to the end of the public lecture for this time. Do you have anything else you'd like to add, Rob, or shall we?
Yeah, if I can, just super quick. I won't keep you up. I've probably spoken
Of
too
course.
much this evening, but I thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Beyond my lecture, that I hope you found useful. I hope you found the idea of the York Public Lecture Series to be an engaging one. I look forward to our future evenings with other members of the faculty, and I'm very much hoping that we can do some great work together with all of those things. So thank you once again, and go gently, everybody.